Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, and good morning. Uh, Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Hetty Jackson-Stops, and I run IPOS Mediation alongside my own practice as a full-time mediator. For those of you who don't know us, IPOS is a hand-picked chambers of many of the leading civil and commercial mediators working in the UK and globally. We have been resolving disputes for nearly 30 years for a variety of clients, including law firms, corporates, individuals, and public sector organisations. We offer a wealth of expertise across a broad range of disputes, including commercial, workplace and employment, public sector, and family business and trust. Before I begin and I make some introductions, a few quick housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded and will be able to watch later. We also should have time for questions at the end, so please feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat. In the Q&A. And if you'd like to communicate with other attendees, please feel free to write in the chat. On to introductions, and I'm thrilled to welcome Rebecca Attree, who is a commercial mediator with IPOS. She has been described as a star mediator who can navigate the choppiest of waters to get the parties to settlement. A qualified solicitor, having worked in the City of London as a solicitor and then had her own solicitor's practice, she became a mediator more than 15 years ago, and since then has been regularly mediating a wide variety of cases. Her main areas are family business, commercial contracts, shareholder and corporate matters, partnerships, trusts, aviation, workplace, and the creative industries. Many of the disputes that Rebecca mediates have an international element, and she frequently mediates disputes between parties from a wide range of cultural and linguistic backgrounds, beliefs, and diversity. I'm also extremely pleased to introduce Tim Phillips, founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict. Tim is a leader in the field of conflict resolution and reconciliation and founder of Beyond Conflict, a global non-profit that has created powerful and innovative frameworks to open pathways for progress in peace talks, transitions to democracy, and national reconciliation in the aftermath of division and violence in dozens of countries around the world. Under his leadership, Beyond Conflict has catalyzed the field of behavioural science and social conflict, and partners with scientists and practitioners to bring forward new evidence-based strategies to reduce conflict, increase tolerance, and facilitate positive social change in the US and abroad. Tim has advised the United Nations, the US Department of State, and the Council of Europe, and helped launch the Club of Madrid, a forum of 120 former democratic heads of state and government who work to strengthen global democracy and institutions. We are very grateful that he's been able to find the time to speak to us today from rainy Boston. Rebecca, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hetty, for the introductions. And thank you, Tim, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today for this fireside chat. One of the areas I'm especially interested in is the psychology behind a dispute and the psychology of the parties engaged in a conflict, and really what tools can be used from a psychological basis to unlock that conflict. And as far as I can understand, this is essential because science tells us that we're fundamentally emotional beings, and we make decisions according to our subconscious rather than our rational mind. And that's been really quite a revelation to me, especially as a solicitor, coming from a rational and analytical background of the law, moving to become a mediator. I've had to move more into this way of thinking. So particularly for those joining today who are dispute resolution professionals, really interested to have this fireside chat with you and to talk about this. So Tim, the thing I think that really blew my mind when I first heard you speak at a conference was you said, and I think I've got this right, we are emotionally shaped beings that can only think rationally when we feel understood as we see ourselves. And this really resonated with me because I've always felt that that's a really big part of being a mediator, to make sure that people feel understood at a mediation. So you're the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the background to your setting that up and what that's involved?
Yeah, well, thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me here this morning or this afternoon and to meet Hattie. So Beyond Conflict, which I was the founder of, is 32 years old, and it started at the end of the Cold War, as we saw the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And, there was a lot of support being given to these new democracies in terms of how do they build democratic institutions, write democratic constitutions, or build market economies. But what wasn't really being offered to them was very much based on what they felt they needed individually, as both individuals, family members, and communities, which is how do we deal with the legacy of communism, repression, dictatorship, and the burden, the emotional, psychological burden living under those sort of systems had on them. Their ability to have agency, to really step into these institutions. So I had this sort of intuitive idea that it would be useful to bring in people who themselves had struggled from dictatorship to democracy. And in 1991, the examples were a few: Argentina, Chile, Spain after Franco, denazification in Germany and elsewhere. And so what started Beyond Conflict was this notion that not only people can learn from the experience of others, there is cross-cultural learning. And while every conflict or country will have its own unique circumstances, there are no unique conflicts around the world. And so at the very core Beyond Conflict was this sort of intuition, and then empirically sort of validated, that people, if curated the right way, can learn from the experience of others. And that was our sort of modus operandi for decades. And we would work in places like Northern Ireland, trying to imagine a way forward, South Africa in the aftermath of apartheid, and many other countries, through this model of shared human experience, lived experience. And so, at the core was a recognition that we share so much as humans, not just our lived experience. And then about a decade ago, we started looking at brain and behavioral science, because we were looking for more insights into the nature of conflict and reconciliation, particularly intractable conflict.
Yeah, you mentioned that your original intuition, and people can learn from the experiences of others who face similarly profound challenges, could be a really powerful force in conflict resolution. And that approach really resonates with me, because I'm also interested in cross-cultural learning. Indeed, I try to apply that on a microcosm from what you've spoken about there, Tim, in my own practice as an international mediator, looking at the different ways that parties mediate in different countries and seeing, can we use some of those techniques that are used more in one country or another in a kind of blended international mediation? But that's probably a topic for another day. Let's today just think a little bit more about how can we learn from shared experiences. And of course, when we apply what you're talking about here, Tim, to that field of mediation per se, we come across a little bit of a difficulty, because mediation is of itself confidential. And therefore, those shared experiences and what's happened in different mediations is not generally available. But what I can say is that dispute resolution professionals and mediators, of course, who frequently mediate, will be seeing those shared experiences and the experiences of others. And I think I take from my experiences three things. I think, firstly, when people negotiate well, they step away from the big picture. They step away from the detail and they keep their eye on the big picture. I think, secondly, they trust their intuition, and I think that's something we're going to explore more as we go through this. And thirdly, even if they're unsure about closing a deal, when they've done it, the coffee the next morning will usually taste better. And why is that? Because they've moved from a position of fear to a position of certainty, and they've hopefully put the past behind them. So let's just think for a moment, Tim, about the language, because I think, we're both in the field of communication here, and I think the language is important. A really significant step here in the UK is that our Ministry of Justice recently dropped the word alternative to the description of mediation. Previously, it was ADR, alternative dispute resolution, and now we've become mainstream to a fanfare of trumpets of those in the mediation community that we are now mainstream dispute resolution. But we've spoken together about conflict management and conflict resolution. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing, going back to a point you made earlier about the confidentiality of mediation, one of the things I've always said to people is, and I'll get to the conflict management versus resolution, is that our approach was to prepare people for negotiations, for mediation, for dialogue. Because in deeply divided communities, countries around the world, and in our country here in the United States right now, the very nature of polarized environments, it's very difficult to bring people in to talk about the substantive issues that divide them at the outset. Now, we can see, obviously, from the outside, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's fear of compromise, what are we losing, and so forth. And often they don't know the other side. And if they know them, they don't have a good view of them, which is the whole purpose of bringing them into mediation or dialogue. And what we have found, and our approach is, long before we got involved with brain and behavioral science, we needed to prepare people psychologically, emotionally for sitting across the table with their enemy, from sitting across the table with somebody who may have done really horrific things to them, or whose views and values they find really fundamentally rejectionable, if there's such a word, right? And also in many of these deeply divided countries that are in war or dictatorship, they never had any interaction with the others. They were caricatures of the evil person or other. And so, and like in a support group way, we would prepare people for those encounters and then work with them along the way and do it through the experience of others who have been in similar situations, like a support group model. So I just wanted to talk to that point about confidentiality, because you can prepare people beforehand in certain ways that others have been through this. And you're not surrendering your values when you find a way forward together. So that's number one. The other is, the field is often called conflict resolution. But one of the things I learned from a friend who's really a mentor from Guatemala, he said, and it's true, we know this in the scholarship, we know this in research and science and so forth. Conflict is inherent in human nature. I mean, the very idea of conflict is that the very idea of democracy, that you can test ideas, you can test policies, right? The problem is when conflict becomes really polarized, toxic, or violent, then that's when it really gets bad, as we know. So conflict is inherent in human nature. So to say to resolve it is almost doing a disservice to the notion of what conflict has to have, which is management and transformation of relationships. And the other is cooperation is deeply embedded in our biology as a species. What becomes very difficult in polarized environments, whether it be big community issues, nations, or I can imagine a mediation, is any notion of cooperating is seen as compromise, which is often seen as a sellout, loss. What am I giving up? Or humiliation. And yet I have a colleague, Josh Green, who's a brilliant scientist who teaches an undergraduate course at Harvard, where he talks about the biology and psychology of cooperation. Literally, life evolved through cooperating for shared benefit. And that's the number one way all the research in social psychology and behavioral science finds that we overcome division and polarization, cooperating over the shared problems we face. And so that's how I might respond to those two things initially.
That's really interesting, Tim. And you make me feel that the question to parties, advisors that we do early on of, will there be a joint open meeting? You make me feel as if it should be more possible than perhaps we allow people to think, because very often the answer will be no, we shouldn't be trying that. But of course, in your field, you're really, that's what you're going to be creating, and why not? And we'll touch more, I think, about on that preparation, but I think certainly the pre-mediation contact with the mediator and preparing people for approaching a meeting, a joint meeting, is something that is important. And I think it's probably been a little bit minimized of late, particularly in the UK, where the practice, I would say probably about 50% of my mediations at the most, we would have a joint open session. I think it is falling out of favor. And certainly, as I understand it, in the United States, it's a rare occurrence at a US mediation to have a joint open.
I just quickly, Rebecca, on that point, because I think it relates to that point, and that is, over the last year, I've brought people from Northern Ireland and South Africa and Central America who I worked with, who sat across these profound divides, to the United States to meet with members of Congress, faith leaders, and communities in the American South and elsewhere. And Rolf Meyer, who had been the chief negotiator for de Klerk in the talks to end apartheid, said that what he and the ANC leadership came to realize at the time is that it was important to get to know each other, focus on process before substance. And then when we went to Atlanta this fall, and you may know the great Andrew Young, who's in his early 90s, he was the lieutenant to Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. He said that Dr. King said to him in 1963, before going to Birmingham, which became one of the iconic moments in the American civil rights struggle, he said, Andy, get to know the people before we confront them. Put a human face on this. And so what is often very abstract and tangible moments in history in a history book become very real when you're in that moment yourself as a nation, right? And so the great experience, not just what's in the research or in the literature or in theory, more importantly, what's in practice of where you could transform, beginning to transform the Jim Crow South or the ending of apartheid, was recognizing, bring people together just to get to know each other, to bring down those walls of resistance that are very emotionally felt.
Absolutely, and it is an element we use the word sometimes dehumanize, and people can dehumanize. And I think in a litigation scenario, sometimes the solicitor on the other side may be thought to be very much the enemy, the difficult person. Whereas if actually there can be a joint open session where they can speak and people can realize actually they're human beings, they are engaging, they're doing their job. Yes, there is a difficulty here. That can change the scenario. Of course, so many of my mediations are family business, and there people know each other, and they may know each other way too well. So that can be a very different scenario, but it may be that they haven't actually seen each other for quite some time, and just looking at each other across a table and engaging can be a very important point. And I think on the second point about conflict management, I think being quite tight at a mediation in terms of what are you actually trying to resolve, accepting, as you've said, Tim, that, conflict is all around us. Sometimes I can find at mediations, people can start throwing in extra points that they would like to have resolved while the people are all there. And actually keeping a tight control on the agenda can be really important, so that at least people can feel they've achieved something in that day. Otherwise, the agenda can just get larger and larger, and actually it becomes an unmanageable amount of things to do. So prioritizing, of course, if there's a claim that's already been issued, then that's what you're mediating. But if it's pre-action, it could be that there are quite a number of broad topics. So that's really interesting. But one of the things I really I'm interested about you, Tim, is that you're a non-scientist, but you came to behavioural science to see how it impacts on conflict resolution. So how much do you think political science and broader social science make assumptions about human nature? And do they take into account cognition and emotion, and actually how that impacts on decision making?
Yeah, thank you. So since most of your folks in the UK, you'll know the name Gerry Adams. So we did a lot of work in the Northern Ireland peace process through the 1990s and starting in the late 80s by bringing in leaders from other countries to Belfast and worked there for over a decade. So I got to know leaders on all sides. So I was teaching a class at a local university here, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and it was called Conflict Transformation in the 21st Century, the Human Dimension, because I felt a lot of the conflict resolution literature. So you talk about mediation practice and literature. Well, in the conflict resolution peace building field, and I wasn't thinking of the science at the time, were very thin on the lived human experience of conflict and reconciliation. So every other class would have a speaker come in. In one class, I had Gerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland, who was in the United States. And a student raised her hand and said, Mr. Adams, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have killed or try to kill, or they may have tried to kill you or somebody close to you? And he paused and he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room. And he was in his mid-70s. He had been one of the pioneers studying neuroscience in the 1950s and 60s. And he came up to me, he had been listening to these different classes. And he said, when I heard the theme of humiliation today, and I've heard in the past empathy and fear, He said, there's a lot of brain and behavioral science research behind those emotions. And I said, what do you mean, the brain and behavioral science research? And he said to me something so perfect, right? He said, well, this was at the back of the classroom. He said to me, let me put it this way. He said, speaking as a scientist, we are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see them, are understood and valued by others. He said that is a core psychological, you could say a biological necessity for how humans navigate the world. And particularly when people feel threatened, uncertain, divided, polarized, that becomes even a more enhanced psychological state. So based in Boston, we have a lot of great universities with researchers at MIT, Harvard, others. And so I then, with a couple of my colleagues, went searching to learn more. And then we met this young, brilliant neuroscientist at MIT. And what she said is, we have to focus more on how we think and not what we think as humans, because more than 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. She said, we think automatically in milliseconds, we think in groups, and we think with mental models of the world. Think of it as an internal GPS system that comes on between 4 and 8 years of age. She said, our brains evolved to be predictive and not reactive. Why? Because we're all descended from those folks in what is now East Africa who didn't pause and ask, is that a friendly pride of lions? Those who did were eaten. So we're all the descendants of people who learned to predict our social and physical environment. And by the way, it's not unique to humans. All living things survive, and our brains are fundamentally wired, in a sense, for survival. And so the more I got into this, the more I realized, well, I went to LSE for grad school and I didn't stay on for a PhD. And I thought, wow, the Enlightenment got a lot of this wrong. You know, the whole, not the whole, but a fundamental foundation of the emergence of the Enlightenment was the emergence of science. That through science, we can get away from what they used to call passions instead of emotions. We can get away from superstition, mythology, even religion, and ground ourselves in real scientific evidence and reason. And yet here's science. And the brain and behavioral science is saying, well, it's actually kind of just the opposite. Our capacity to even think rationally is shaped by that unconscious brain. And to your point about cognition and emotion, working at MIT, and if you ever had to work in a university, you have to get tenured faculty involved to get funding and support. But we had this initial partnership for years with MIT to launch this work, engaging brain and behavioral scientists. And so we had the cognitive sciences and the dean of sciences, but then we got the head of political science and the dean of humanities, because we had postdocs who looked at civil conflict and found that in their field of political science, they only looked at individuals who were leaders, and they analyzed everything through the lens of groups. And they completely discounted cognition and emotion. Think of this. Cognition and emotion is either how we think or feel. How do you miss that? And so it was the dean who said to me about 8 years ago that we are graduating PhDs in economics and political science at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who discount cognition and emotion. And yet we know over here it's just the opposite. And in fact, one of our conferences on norms, narratives, and neurons, the head of political science wrote me a note and said, in political science and more broadly in the social sciences, we ignore cognition and emotion as we think about what shapes human behavior. So I just want to point that out because it confirmed what I was finding and seeing. And subsequently, we helped shape political scientists who were going off and getting tenure track, where they were getting funding to engage with brain and behavioral scientists. Because science, evidence, and we all know this, we don't need to be a neuroscientist to know, we either think or we feel. And that's cognition and emotion. And yet it's so discounted in so many of the frameworks, not just, I'm sure, in mediation, which I've seen here, or conflict resolution, but even in diplomacy and negotiations in many other areas.
That's so interesting, because I think, at a good mediation, people will feel understood. And how can they feel understood? Well, firstly, are they understood by the mediator? And of course, the mediator's neutral. They're not going to necessarily say they're not going to say whether they agree or not with that party, but making that party feel listened to and understood is incredibly important. So that classic part of the early stage of the mediation where the party tells the mediator how they see things. And sometimes solicitors will say, actually, we don't need to spend much time on this. They've heard this already probably far too many times by the time they get to the mediation, and they're keen to get on and get to, exchanging offers, which is, fantastic if you're trying to be pragmatic. But actually, discounting that moment when the party can just vent and say how it is, and the mediator can say, I can see where you're coming from on this. I can understand why you would be feeling like this, is incredibly powerful.
It actually, in neuroimaging, that creates a cognitive shift.
Yeah, exactly. Because then the party feels, right, somebody here gets me. And the last thing you want is that the client, the party in the conflict, says to their advisor when the mediator isn't in the room, the mediator doesn't get me. That's the last thing you want. And I think that's where the risk can be when it comes to probing and challenging, because the classic model of a mediation involves after a little bit of time, the mediator challenging and probing parties' views. And I think it's incredibly important that that is done in a way that is sensitive and probably comes with a bit of a health warning to the party to say, look, I'm neutral, I'm independent, but my role is to get you to think about things differently, to understand where the other party is coming from, as well as for you to be understood. And therefore, part of what I'm going to be doing is asking you some questions. Now, please don't read too much into my questions. Just because I'm asking you something doesn't mean to say, I don't agree with you, or, heaven help me, I don't like you or something. I'm literally here helping you to see things from different points of view and to challenge your own thoughts. And indeed, sometimes, if I'm being exceptionally kind, when it comes to that moment, I will say, do you remember I said early on I was going to ask you a difficult question? Well, here is one for you. Because otherwise, if a mediator comes in and starts doing this heavy duty probing, we can get the cognitive shift going the other way, right? That then the party feels, I'm not understood. And then the other thing is, can you get them to be understood by the other room? Now, that's a bigger challenge, of course. But if actually, as the mediator, you can bring back some words, some expressions where, yeah, actually, do you know what? You both feel the same way about this, to normalize it, mutualize it, to say, they understand why you might see it like that, but, perceptions and memories can be different. And making it such that people feel that they can feel understood can actually mean that they can then move forward to making offers. It is rare that somebody will come in and make an offer on the table the second they come in, but even if they do, I would usually say to them, let's just step back for a moment and think, what's going to be the effect of landing that offer into the other room at this stage of the mediation, especially if actually it's something that isn't favourable at all. The other party is going to feel they don't understand at all. And why are we even here? So these, I think, are things that are very important about this feeling understood by other. And indeed, you can even get more into, how does the body react to this, and how do we feel when we're not feeling understood, and do people's breathing patterns change? I mean, I'm a breathwork instructor, and I notice people's breathing patterns. And a simple technique, if someone is feeling not understood and they're starting to move into that different cognitive shift, could be that they do some slow breathing, breathing in for 4, holding for 2, out for 6. A really simple technique, but actually, even those engaged in the law, if they see that their client is going to be suffering in this way, to say to somebody in the break between the sessions, let's just get ourselves into a different mental state. I don't know, Tim, if you've got anything to add on that.
Yeah, well, one of the things we've been doing for the last several years is working with a lot of displaced communities from Syria and other countries from various wars. And they're in refugee camps. For example, there is a significant refugee camp just over the border in Jordan called Attree. And through some funding, we developed something called the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, because a lot of the humanitarian refugee assistance organizations were doing great basic support, but when it came to mental health support, they were a bit antiquated or limited. And what we found is that when you provide communities with a story and some explanation very accessibly about what's happening in their brain, and then we did breathing exercises, meditation, yoga, that combination, and there was a randomized control test done after 2 or 3 years of looking at doing it on an app, doing it in a classroom, and so forth, had a significant impact in reducing people's cortisol, stress levels, increasing their oxytocin, trust, and their overall physiological, psychological, health. And the reason being is it's tied to not only feeling understood by others, actually learning about the brain allows people to understand themselves better, because when you're under stress, particularly when you're fleeing a country during a war, you have suicidal thoughts, there's more domestic violence, there's more anger, there's more uncertainty, unpredictability. And to learn that other human beings faced with the same situation would respond the same way reduces a lot of stigma and shame. But we found that just doing that alone without doing the breathing and the meditation yoga was not impactful, because we know, as you know, this research that just breathing reduces cortisol levels. And it's such a critical component of this work. And also, I did some work with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he would say during the Truth Commission hearings in South Africa, he would say to his fellow commissioners of the Truth Commission, we need to get away, go in nature, and breathe and process what we're experiencing, because they were taking in a lot of this trauma, a lot of this, emotional pain. And for the people who may have been perpetrators, there are anger and resistance, uncertainty, and fear. And he came to realize you had to do what you just said in mediation. So it's profoundly important. And the other thing I'll say is one of the things I learned from somebody in this work is to know the difference between expansion and contraction. When you feel understood, it's more expansive at an energetic level. When you feel misunderstood, when you feel uncertain, fearful, what do? We contract within ourselves. And so one way to open up expansion is not only feeling understood, but these breathing exercises. And there's just such evidence on this. And even the most experienced negotiators felt like they need to do that.
Yeah, it's hard to remember it when you're in the moment, particularly in a very busy and intensive commercial mediation. But actually, you're so right, Tim. And as I understand it, actually, breathwork is even used at the UN, the United Nations, before entering into negotiations. And at the moment, people are saying this is all a new thing, but actually, it so isn't. I mean, this idea of pranayama and yoga, I'm also a yoga instructor, has been around for centuries, and it's been used. And I think we forget, and these are things that could be in the toolkit of dispute resolution professionals, as well, of course, as knowing their law, inside out and being great advocates. This aspect of the physiological side of what's going on with the client, and even at a very basic level, just making sure that they are fed and watered, and that there are the occasional breaks from the intensity of the discussion about the case to lighten things up. Even down to giving the other party the better room. Why would you not do that? Why would you sit in the best room in your office and put the others in, the tiniest room? Make sure that the other party is feeling as comfortable as possible, because it will play out well. Shall we just touch on maybe for a minute, Tim, what you were saying about, humans? It was thought, at MIT, humans are fundamentally rational beings, but we know it's the opposite. How do you think really, when people are coming to make decisions and hope and bringing hope to a difficult negotiation, how do you think that plays out?
Well, again, it all depends on the nature of the negotiation, right? And what is being discussed. But one of the things I've learned from both experience and science is, as I mentioned earlier, process over substance, and not just technical process, not just legal process, but process that has a way for people to get to know each other. And then what needs to be added in is that there's now this behavioral science research that shows how fundamental that is, because at that physiological, psychological level, it reduces fear, It increases trust. It increases a willingness to engage. And so there are different ways. And it also depends on the nature of the dialogue or the mediation. You mentioned family businesses. I'm writing a piece right now that in traditional sort of conflict resolution, peace building work, they talk about interest, they talk about values. And I'm saying, well, everybody knows interest. I mean, you can define them. Parties often put that on a list and table. This is what's really key to them. What are the values about the nature of this particular group or the other group? But within values, there is also sacred values and not just religious values. So what research has found that there are some values, and they put sacred in quotes around it, that are like a profound sacred principle, that when people are asked to compromise them, they respond more aggressively and hold on to them more deeply. And they're processed in a different region of the brain than utilitarian calculations. Why? Because as very social beings, it's really important to recognize where you situate yourself, not only as an individual in the world, in the groups that are most important to you. So think of like, if you're a parent, the protection of your young infant is a sacred value. If you're a deeply observant member of a religious tradition, those values are above compromise. You could go down a list and think of things that are shaped by you as an individual or the group you're in, that these are above compromise. And when people come in with a utilitarian trade-off, let's cut this deal, let's give you this amount of money. If you don't recognize that what you're asking people to compromise is held as a sacred value, you're going to get a backfire effect. But it doesn't mean that sacred values are not malleable. Doesn't mean that all sacred values are malleable. It starts with what we said before. You have to give a symbolic concession. Say, Rebecca, I understand how key this is to you, that this position, this is a value, and we understand that and respect that you hold it as a value. Doesn't mean you have to agree with the value, but you understand how important it is. There's a ton of research showing that validation, that symbolic concession, when they put people in fMRI machines, creates a cognitive shift. So you can begin to have a conversation. And so to your point is, there are ways to not only think about a process of mediation. What we do in conflict is a landscape and conflict analysis. Just how intense is this conflict? What's at stake? How do you not only look at interests? How do you not only look at values, but those sacred values? And the other thing I would add to the field, in our field, and I'm sure, what are the cognitive factors at play? And what are the misperceptions? We've done a lot of research in the United States on the meta misperceptions between Democrats and Republicans, and consistently find that both parties, individuals within those parties, overestimate the gap between them and the other side on big issues like immigration, abortion, gun control by 50%. They overestimate how much they think the other side dislikes them by 50%, and how much they think the other side dehumanizes them. So when you go into an environment like the United States, or any conflict, or a mediation, I mean, you could also do surveys and ask the parties, where are you on these issues at the table? Or how much you think the other party dislikes you? Maybe not dehumanize you, that's maybe a stretch there in that setting. But it gives you not only a window into how people feel, but more importantly, an avenue to say, they overestimate the gap by significant percentage. And we're finding this in test after test. And it gives you an entry point to say, you actually have more in common than you would know, because you're not in dialogue, or you have this anger. So there are different ways that set up a process that build upon the best of mediation or conflict management, peace building work, but add in these factors that are both, led by evidence and practice, but also affirmed by research and science.
Yeah, I even had a mediation where actually the dispute resulted from a difference in sacred values. That was actually what it was. And we spent quite a bit of time in the early part of the mediation exploring what actually the values were of each of the parties. And during that time, it did, as you've just said, Tim, become apparent that actually they weren't so far apart. And one of the really interesting things that happened was when I said to each of them, well, according to your values, how would you resolve a dispute? What is your belief in how this should happen? And they both came up with the same answer. And it was basically, to be mediating. So that brought them back around to think, yeah, we're actually in the right place. We're doing the right thing. And then we looked further into the detail of these different values. And we saw that in some cases they weren't aligned. And we said, okay, can you just agree to differ on this? And let's try to find now a more practical and pragmatic approach to how you can coexist. And that way, then, at that point, they were then willing to explore that. Whereas if we'd begun at the very start by saying, okay, these are the issues, this is the money, this is what's on the table, these are the properties, what are we going to do? It wasn't going to play out. Whereas exploring it from how you've explained there, Tim, is, I think, in that case, it did unlock quite a lot of the conflict.
Can I just add one thing, Rebecca? In the United States, there is this huge tension and issue of what's owed to Native American communities. So within the United States, many of the Native American communities have achieved a certain sovereign status. And in the Dakotas, South and North Dakota, they're the Black Hills. And among Lakota Sioux and Dakota Sioux tribes, the Black Hills are sacred, literally sacred. And so they had a deal in the 19th century with the US at a presidential level. And then subsequent to that, a lot of these hills were mined, developed without their permission. So they sued 20 years ago. And the federal courts of the United States granted them a significant monetary reward. And this tribe of less than 2,000 people who would incredibly benefit from this money refuses to take it because it doesn't recognize their sacred status within their community.
Yeah.
Think of this. That money is now well over $1 billion, and they won't take it until they feel that these sacred values and that the sacredness of their claim is recognized by the federal government and by the state.
Yeah. So people are having that sense of this isn't just about the dispute. There's something more fundamental that leads them to decide.
And there's even a bigger blowback if you think it's just about money. If people think you're being asked me to something profound to me for money, you get a worse response.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of mediation. It doesn't have to all be about money. Frequently when people go to court, that's what's going to be the bottom line. And that's where often people who go to court are actually not satisfied because they still don't feel that their values have been recognized. And I think linked to this is really this issue of forgiveness. And, to mediations, the best mediations I've had is where one party apologizes to the other, either through me. I had one where somebody actually wrote a letter of apology that I then delivered into the other room. And it was profound, the effect of that apology coming forward. And I'm sure, Tim, in your work, you must see this issue.
Yeah, I have met some extraordinary individuals around the world who have been through unspeakable horror, violence, torture, imprisonment, loss of many members of their family. And a number of the ones I met made a choice on their own to forgive the perpetrator and got huge resistance from their communities for how dare you do that. And they felt that act of forgiveness released them from the pain of that experience and trauma. They said, we never forgot. This is not forgetting, but it's as much for the holder of that trauma as it is for anybody else. And I have a colleague who's a scientist who's in one of the universities here, who's from the country of Colombia. And he's been doing research with neuroimaging on forgiveness and finding that when people choose to forgive, not forget, it reduces the salience, the connection of that neural memory that's attached to the original experience significantly. It reduces their PTSD so they don't experience it in a very harmful way. And so forgiveness is a personal choice, but there's profound power in forgiving. And people feel it's the most cathartic thing they did for themselves. And yet it's more difficult for people who didn't experience it directly. They want revenge. And you see it consistently. They want revenge. There's something like they want to make up for or support or do something, but they don't carry personally that burden. And those who carry it are the most prepared to let it go. And again, not forgetting. And so there's real power in that.
I think so. I mean, particularly in family business mediations, I see sometimes somebody will apologize, especially if there's actually been a claim brought for an Inheritance Act claim and someone is saying, no, that person is not a dependent, you know, they were just the handy person who was around. They weren't actually a part really of the wider family group. And it can be very difficult, though, because, of course, if the mediation doesn't settle, if the matter doesn't settle at the mediation, the matter could still go to court. And so parties can feel, well, you know, where does this sit in the mediation bubble? You know, maybe we get this apology, but then afterwards, if it doesn't settle, then we still are going to court. And that's where I think an early apology can be incredibly powerful, because then that can unlock people to think, yeah, right, now we really are talking. We're stepping away from what I might call the position of parties that's put into their pleadings, and now we're looking at actually what are their interests, you know, going back to Fisher and Urey of the 1980s and the books of, you know, getting to yes and getting past no, and what's really underlying this. And yes, there's been this whole issue that's been put together from a legal point of view, but the reality is that, yeah, we accept and we acknowledge that this person was actually important to the deceased, and therefore in principle we're willing to turn a corner here and think, yeah, okay, some money should be paid to them. So again, there we have this belief, and then the money comes after. And so it comes back to that more time spent early on engaging in these issues can really, I think, help later in the mediation. I can see time's coming on, and there's a few questions that are coming in the chat. Perhaps we should just pause for a moment and just see what's here. Thank you, Hetty, for kindly moderating.
Yes. No, absolutely. Do put your questions in the Q&A if you have any. First one from Tim. Are you able to repeat the name of the person who was talking about biology and the psychology of cooperation? I thought his name was Josh Green.
Yeah, Joshua Green.
Joshua Green.
He wrote a great book about a decade ago called Moral Tribes. And he hasn't written the book yet on cooperation, but it's a course he teaches.
Okay.
But it's really powerful.
Yeah. And a question from Ahmed to Tim, talking of conflicting sacred values, how do you see going beyond the conflict in occupied Palestine so that it can be resolved? I mean, that's a very pertinent question, and a big question to go into in the next couple of minutes. But perhaps on drawing on some of the things you said.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to Gaza in the past many times, and the West Bank and Israel, and we had done work with Israeli and Palestinian negotiators of the past to try to find a way forward for a two-state solution. And I remember writing a memo a few years ago for the head of the quartet after Tony Blair. And I talked about sacred values and how critical that is, because for the Palestinian, broader Muslim, Arab community, Jerusalem is a very profound sacred place. The same for Israelis and Christians. But also the right of return for Palestinians was sacred. But as we look at the conflict today, you know, and this is very difficult for people, but it goes to forgiveness. And I'm not suggesting forgiveness, but we have to, and I'm not saying there isn't a role for that, but what I would say is that recognizing profound loss is a recognition of a sacred value. In other words, it's not a value to have profound loss, but to recognize that the loss that Palestinians and Israelis feel has the equivalent of a sacred value. It's core to people's identity. And it's not just their identity as this is what defines me, but this violence, this loss has defined me and my community. And until people recognize that, the pain, then it's really hard to engage. And I remember we did some work on the opening with Cuba, and we were working with Cuban Americans, and we were bringing in people from South Africa and Northern Ireland to engage. And I remember at one point, I was talking about branding behavioral science to the White House and the State Department, because we were doing work in that opening and reconciliation. And finally, one of the senior State Department officials, after the U.S. agreed to open relations with Cuba, he said there's a lot of pushback from the Cuban American community, which is many of them deeply conservative, who felt profound loss for being forced to leave and lost everything. Many people lost people who were killed. And what I recommended is that at the time, then Vice President Biden in the White House should speak to the Cuban American community and recognize the loss of their family, feel like they're understood, because many Cuban Americans were prepared to reconcile with Cuba, but they didn't want to be disloyal to their family and to the suffering of their parents and grandparents. They couldn't do that. And for that need to be recognized had a profound impact on people's willingness to consider engaging with Cuba in the future. Now, what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank and Israel is such a painful moment for all involved, but I think it's important to recognize this loss. People need to have that felt and heard and understood. Almost, first of all, the violence has to stop. But the recognition of this loss, I think, is an important step.
Really, really interesting. And it's all, it's coming back to bringing humanity back, isn't it? And bringing humanity back into recognizing others. We have a rather, I think, tongue-in-cheek suggestion from Leon, although I think it's a great idea, Leon, on bringing basic breathing exercises to clients during the mediation and starting opening plenary sessions with a group breathing exercise. I think it's a great idea. I think we should definitely introduce it in our next mediation, Leon, and I look forward to you leading the breathing work. I actually had a question, Tim. Well, it wasn't really a question, it was a thought. It was a thought about this, the ongoing conversation about AI and a conversation about AI mediators, and will we ever be able to resolve our disputes with the use of artificial intelligence? But if we are essentially emotional beings who can only act rationally if we are understood and heard, is it therefore impossible to say that you'd have an effective mediator or conflict resolver coming out of a AI system?
Yeah, one thing I think, just to clarify, it's not that we can never think rationally until we feel understood, but it's a key component, particularly when you feel misunderstood, when you feel threatened, when you feel uncertainty, fear, right? And I've had conversations with researchers who say I mentioned our brains evolved to be predictive. And one scientist wrote that a question that the brain constantly asks all the time is, what do people think about me and us? So feeling understood is just this sort of implicit, unconscious sort of touch point to feel safe. And it's heightened when we feel unsafe. I mean, AI, personally, I'm very concerned about AI on multiple levels. I don't know enough about it, but both my instinct and conversations with folks is it's very risky. And to have AI do mediation, I mean, everything we just talked about in the last 45 minutes, emotionally resonant AI system, no, not yet. Never.
Well, that's a huge relief for us as mediators in our profession, I must say. Rebecca,
I agree with what Tim said on that. I think you need that human touch, and yes, there are ODR systems, online dispute resolution systems, that will give an answer, but are people actually going to feel okay with that? Is very questionable.
I think we have time for we've got one more question here, which was how do mediators, from Carl, how do mediators deal with the challenge of identifying the cause or mischief of a conflict? Rebecca, perhaps over to you on that one.
I think that's a brilliant question. Thank you very much indeed. And that is definitely a challenge. I think it's really by asking questions and asking open questions and listening and just seeing what people actually say in each room. And so often I find that actually I'm hearing a very similar thing in both rooms. And it's not going in as a mediator with a presumption of, well, this is what the problem is here, and heaven help us, this is how it might be solved. It's actually going in with a complete open mind and tell me what's been going on. And very often I've had mediations where actually what the root cause is something completely different to something anybody said. I mean, I had one about 20 properties between a very large family of 10 siblings, and it all seemed to be about the properties and the capital gains tax. They were all in the wrong names. People were living in properties that they didn't own. But the root cause of the whole thing was the passport of the disabled minor, and who was actually going to be looking after that young person, and were they going to be allowed to travel and to leave the country. And that actually came out probably after about an hour, just by talking to people. It's amazing when you get in there and you say, well, what's really been going on? What's actually the problem here? Very often what's actually been in all the bundle is different. And if you're then authorized to say that to the other room, and they go, well, yes, of course, that's where it all started. And that's how it comes out. So it's all those questions and listening, and just being super careful never to interrupt or to even jump in too quickly, because in my experience, when people pause, that's when they're going to tell you the real nuggets. And so as a mediator, it's about just, in your own way, taking a bit of a deep breath and just thinking, I'm going to be comfortable with this silence for a moment, not so that the people feel, a little bit frozen out, but just to have that extra that bit of a second where people will then tell you more. And that's when the real truth comes out.
Absolutely. Tim, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's spot on. I would say two things that are really key. One is that all conflict fundamentally is about identities. People used to think that the conflict in Northern Ireland was a religious conflict. No, it's about identity. And country after country after country, it's about, or setting after setting after setting, it's about identities at risk. And it's tied to how people define themselves as individuals, as a family, as a community, but also when they feel they're under threat, and it goes back to when they feel they're understood. So when we look at the deepening polarization in the United States, it's identity-based, and how those identities are playing out and how they're shifting and how they're being siloed. And one thing we know from brain and behavioral science, when polarization becomes identity-based, then a whole range of unconscious psychological processes come online to drive us further apart. So if any of the listeners want to go to our website, there's a report called America's Divided Mind, Understanding the Psychology That Divides Us or Shapes Us. You'll see this research, and it's global in its application because we all have the same psychology as humans fundamentally, but it's shaped by context. And I think that's a very good primer to understanding a lot of what we talked about.
That's brilliant, Tim. Thank you. I'm certainly going to go and find that. It's been incredibly interesting, your talk. And Rebecca, thank you for bringing Tim to us this morning. It's been, or this afternoon. It's been really, really interesting. So thank you, Tim, for your time. Thank you, Rebecca, for your time too. And I hope you've all enjoyed that. We will follow up perhaps with some of those titles that you've referred to. We can put that in a follow-up email because I think that would be very useful for our audience.
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Hattie, and for everybody listening in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute privilege to share this fireside chat with you. I've learned a lot by working on this, and I think the takeaway really is, even in a big commercial mediation, there are emotional and psychological factors at play. And thank you, Hetty, for moderating. Thank you to Sophie for setting this up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.